Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I am Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be talking to you about post-production that packs a punch, right? So many of us are using Lightroom, maybe you're using Adobe Camera Raw, maybe you're using another RAW processor, and then eventually going into Photoshop. And so I want to talk about how we can take some of those actions and dodging and burning and sort of more creative editability in Photoshop, and how can we do that in Lightroom and do it effectively, right? So a few things that I want to talk about is how to make your subject stand out. Now we all know when you're looking at the back of your camera, your images are always looking sweet, right? They look pumped up. That's you're looking at a JPEG preview through your RAW file. Maybe you have some of that pumped up in some of your settings in the viewing. But whenever you take it into Lightroom, it always falls short of that sort of punch, right? It's always flat. It always looks a little more tonally, tonal dynamic range is a little, it's a little off. And so, in looking at how to keep things in Lightroom, how to direct the viewer with some local adjustments, and maybe thinking about breaking out of your box, right? As creatives, whether you're constantly pushing the limits, trying something new, even if it's a fail, at least you're trying, at least you're creating, and not sort of just repeating or duplicating what you know works. Of course, for techniques and editing and things like that, yeah, of course, you want to do what works. But when it comes to like toning and editing and style, I think it's okay to push past the box, live a little, right? So I want to do some of that, exploring color profiles in the newest version of Lightroom Classic, as well as pushing some dodging and burning techniques with local adjustments. Many of you might have already be doing this, but it's kind of more of a simple build-up kind of step process of dodging and burning, so you have less hard edges. It's a little bit quicker to show you some of those techniques. So let's jump into the capture to creative changes in the develop module and get started. So typically whenever I get done with the shoot, I'm going to call it down. I'm going to choose my top 20, 30, 15, whatever number I have in my mind, but I want to choose my top images to do some of these more creative, more kind of dynamic edits, right? So my end goal for this shoot here is putting something together kind of like this. It's nothing super crazy. It's a little bit heavy on the, darkening the background, a little heavy in the blues, dramatic, but there's not a massive shift in sort of the capture to the end result here. So in talking about how I can get to this result, first we got to correct some of the issues in the image, right? So I'm looking at my shot here, right? So I am working on a TIFF file, just because some of the things that I might have done in Photoshop up front might be the liquefy, might be some body sculpting and things like that. That's normal in my process. I'm always going to do that up front on my raw files, just so I have all the information. I don't have to dig through toning. I kind of do all the shaping first to sort of show you one way to work, right? Other people might say, nope, forget it. I do all my retouching when I'm done editing in Lightroom, or if I'm doing retouching, I do it all in Photoshop. Not what I'm looking to do here. Just advocating for, I did some retouching. Here, I'll even show you what I did, so that way we know kind of where we're going from here. So in viewing this image here, we just, fix some of the dress, right? Nothing too crazy with some of those things. So starting out with our TIFF file, we know, and working in a raw processor, I'm not looking to do a whole lot of, changes with the tonality of this image, but I want to get it corrected. It doesn't need a whole lot, to going back, and I don't lose a lot of information working on a TIFF versus a raw. So jumping in, what I'm going to do is look at, what I need to, correct for the background so I can dodge the subject out, right? So I'm thinking about total image here. I'm not thinking about the main subject. I'm thinking about total image. What's going to be the least amount of work brush-wise for me to get started? Well, I'm going to look at that and go, well, I'm going to just expose for the background. So if I want my background to be dark and dramatic, and I really like the way that landscape is starting to look, we look at my histogram here, and it looks pretty radical here, in comparison to, here's my raw file. you know, kind of some interesting lack of tonality, if you will, or the contrast is a little limiting. I'm going to go ahead and hide that for now so that way we don't get distracted. But looking at this background here, I really want to darken it down, and now she's getting too dark, right? She's almost becoming a silhouette in her shape here, and her skin tones are becoming really dull, but what we're looking to do is expose for the total image, right? So we're going to darken for the whole image, dodge her out. Much simpler, she's a much smaller space, much easier for us to do. So by doing that, I can now look at, you know, my focal length. Looking at a 105 millimeter, great, who cares, right? Shooting with the 70 to 200, it's the go-to portrait lens, of course. You got ISO 50, so we're gonna have a lot of flexibility in this image and a lot of tonal range, which is great. Opened up aperture, so the background's blurry, blah, 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 right? All the technical stuff. Let's start correcting some of these things, right? So I'll go into the lens correction, and in applying my profile correction, I will grab, let's see here, by default, I'll go in here and grab Canon. And again, these kind of things are happening because I'm working on a TIFF. I'm not working on the RAW. It might grab a little bit quicker for the raw file. That's okay. What I want to do is I want to keep some of that vignetting. You know, it's not a massive amount, but it's something just to correct the image for us. If we go over to our raw file, let's take a look here and see. Yeah, you can see the kind of difference here a little bit more. Just want to kind of show you this. You lose that kind of flair, creative vignetting here when you do the the profile correction. So I always take that vignetting and drop it down to 0, which works out really well. So that way you can just correct some of that distortion there. Same thing that we did with our TIFF file, right? So another thing that I'd want to do is I'd want to start looking at tools to darken some of this background, add a little bit of depth. I can do that by opening up my histogram and looking at my clipping, right? You'll notice that if we hold shift, click on whites, that gets us back to a kind of more solid white point, but it really kind of ruined our image for the most part for what we're looking to do. I mean, we don't need to have that kind of contrast in this image. I mean, I'm not looking to pump it up that much. So I kind of like this muted background as it is. We'll work on her skin tones with the dodging and burning. So I'm not worried about bringing the white point to shift the histogram. We can drop black point down. I think the black point's pretty solid in terms of definition and density. But another thing that I like to use is the dehaze tool, right? If we drop it into the negatives, starts to like wash out our background. Not a big fan of that. But we can add some dehaze as it starts to really darken our sky. And kind of give it a push here. Now I think it gets a little over the top there at plus 50. But 15, 20, I mean that gives it, let's see here. So it just gives a little bit of definition in the background, a little bit of saturation. I might turn that down to 15. And those are kind of the adjustments that I'm really looking to do. Kind of taking it from where we started and just darkening the image down just a bit. Just kind of gives the background, already kind of gets the background where I want it. Might do a little bit of manipulating, of course, but now I can start to dodge my subject based on some of these adjustments that we made. And that's our next step, right? We want to direct the audience. We want to use local adjustments, but we want to do the least amount of local adjustments because it can be tedious doing a bunch of brush work. So let's jump into the adjustment brush and take our attention back to the client. All right, so now that we've gone into the adjustment brush panel, now we can start to look at building up some effects or building up our dodge for our client so that way she can pop out of the image and not be so kind of dark and blocked up in terms of density. So in looking at our adjustment brush layer, right, we have all these pre-built options here and a bunch of custom made brushes and things like that. What I like to do is start out simple and build up my brush work. So when it's a close-up image, I might be a little looser in sort of my brush size, painting things in to kind of create a custom vignetting look rather than just dodging the client. It's just something to kind of go quickly. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. So when we're thinking about exposure, I like to think about it to start with 3 steps, right? So in going back to my let's get out of this panel. And looking at, we drop the exposure down to -50. I like the way the subject looks at 0. So what that tells me is I need to do basically positive half a stop of dodging or exposure to get her back to where she was. And then we can build things up from there. So what I like to do is I'll divide that 50 by 3. And that gets me, I'm not going to get crazy into math here, but I think 15 is going to be a good starting point. It's going to get me to about 0.45, if you will, of of exposure adding in, but it's going to be something that we can kind of do and be a little more subtle about. So what I want to talk to you about is how I would normally start with the large brush, add a new mask, do a smaller brush, add a new mask, do a smaller brush. So in doing that, right, if I kind of create that effect here, we're automatically going to see some haloing, and we're kind of like, oh, that looks terrible. And I agree, right? So this is an image where it's not going to lend itself like a wedding, like a reception shot, or something to where it's we can be a little more loose with our exposure adjustment. I mean, if we wanted to kind of do something like this, that kind of defeats the purpose of our background, right? So with a shot like this, we're most likely going to want to be a little more tedious with just dodging our subject, and that's okay, right? So in going through, and just dodging her, we want to make sure a few things, right? We have our brush right, we have our feathering at 100, which is really important. You want it to fall off the subject. You don't want it to be a hard edge. With those things, flow left at 100 is fine. We're not doing auto mask, but in showing auto mask, we can be a little looser with our brush, and just kind of seeing what it's going to do. Doesn't do a terrible job, but it doesn't do a great one, right? So we can go through and use our erase brush here to get rid of those. And again, if we want to kind of watch how well the auto brush works, not terrible, not great, but it gets us, in a starting point here. So turning that off, we can kind of see, all right, we've added a little bit of our, definition in our client. So now, in spending that time, now that we've done that, if we want to increase this, we can, right? So we made our mask, we can increase our exposure, and if we put this to plus 50, we'd say, okay, our subject's kind of back to where we want her to go. But what I like to do is in building up, different layers and having it, blend a little bit better, is you can add, right? If we want to bring up some of the shadows just a little bit, so that way we can get, the definition in the dress where we want it to be, as well as if we want to add a little bit of white point. If we add whites, that'll brighten her skin up naturally. So you can start to do those kind of adjustments to correct just that area. But instead, if we keep this simple, and I'll keep shadows at 5 as well. If we keep, adding on adding on dodging layers, we can start to accentuate her skin tones and specifically where we want to dodge and burn. So instead of just bringing the dress up, bringing the dress up, bringing the dress up, we can, I'm pretty happy with the way this looks tonally. I want to bring her skin tone up to be the brightest part of the image. So that way that's where our focus goes, right? Because if we close our eyes, zoom out on our image, we want our focus to be right here. There's a lot of negative space up here. Compositionally, it's, in this vertical, so it's easy to circling around and losing focus on her. We want to make sure our adjustments, our dodging and burning, are bringing us back to the subject here. So in doing that, we can click on new, and we can just kind of continue to dodge her just a bit. And so in building each of those up, we can kind of get her exactly where we're looking, maybe one step back, and just kind of bringing her back to where she needs to be. And so as we build up these layers and work on this, we're going to come back to dodging and burning once we add our color profiles and color grading, because we might want to bring some more definition out of the dress, but we don't know how this dress is going to shift once we get to that point, right? So we want to make sure in doing this in steps. Now we got her looking the way we want to, the background's looking dark the way we want to. We can even go in and do some darkening on the background, which I think would be okay to do. If we just do some burn, -30. I'm going to turn off auto mask. That's a little heavy. We can do that. This brings up a really good point for us to use our radial filter, right? So I'm going to go ahead and undo that mask here. Let's make sure we got rid of our pen. So we can always select on another mask if we need to. We have our different pins there. We can bring in a gradient filter. Darken that down pretty quickly. Use a brush. Erase it on our face, stuff like that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'll leave that on there. That's okay. So now we can move into the color profiles and color grading to really create some separation by cooling down the background. We can darken some of these blues. We can brighten some of these tones on her to make her pop off the page a little bit more, and move into more of the creative toning application of this edit. So now we get to move into the more fun and creative part of the editing, and that's going to be the toning with the color profiles and showing you how you can do some color grading to create some separation with your client and this beautiful landscape, right? So what I really love about Lightroom Classic's most recent update, I think back on 7.31, they introduced the profile browser. And so the profile browser is broken up between camera profiles, which we've all used, with Visco profiles, Hue Light. There's develop profiles, like a bunch of different film and creative color profiles to kind of get either a creative look or more color matching look, which has kind of always been the issue with Lightroom, right? They have like camera standard and Adobe standard and camera neutral to kind of have Adobe match the camera manufacturer profiles, which are built into the cameras, which are what you're looking at, and the colors kind of render a little bit different with the sensor and the RGB primaries. You're always kind of like battling those things, right? So what I love about Lightroom Classic is they have these creative profiles now, which you can apply. The artistic, black and white, modern, and vintage, which kind of give your images this interesting toning application, which you have the ability to manipulate the amount, but you don't have to create this monster preset or buy a preset online. It kind of gives you some different toning shifts that you can start off with. Even on a TIFF file, as we're working on here, you don't have to be working on a RAW, which is pretty awesome. So looking at the different groups, I've really come to like the modern profiles. And if we want to kind of take a look at what these will look like on our image, we can hover over each one and determine, yeah, that's not the one I like. And you can see these stars here, right? So I've created some favorites, but just going down the line, what's going to make sense for our image here? Not a big fan of most of these, but I've really liked the modern 8. I think we need to tweak it back a little bit here. It looks like a little crazy. And the modern 10 is kind of just a little subtle boost. And tonal shift, but we kind of lose that punch, right? I like that with the modern 8 that we still have a punch. Modern 9 is kind of between these two, kind of just flat and cool. So I'm going to stick with the modern 8. And something that I can do as well is I can control the amount or opacity if you're used to more Photoshop terms. But I can take the amount down to like 40 to where I can start to look at the difference between my edit, from start to finish. I can really start to see that shift and just adding a little bit of a little bit of a creative flair here. So what I want to do now is I want to start to look at clarity and vibrance and how I can boost this subject a little bit further. So if I'll add some clarity in here because it's not a close-up shot on her, right? So, and adding some clarity and especially some vibrance here can really help heighten the mood of this image, but also give me some of that, it's a presence panel, right? So it's going to give me, details, a little more focus. This is where kind of my presence panel and sharpening and all that start to come into play, as well as more of the zeroing in on some of the color and adjusting specific colors. So like if I want to cool down some of these mid-tones back here and really darker tones. Now this might affect the dress as well, so we have to be careful because it's not just the background we're going to be adjusting, but it's going to be every sort of tonal range in working with tone curve. And what you can do is you can go to the point curve. So normally when you go to the tone curve, you have this section here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And so if we click on the point curve, now we can create a custom look. We can start to do kind of, well, don't want to do that. That's not what I'm looking to do. But I think many of us will take like shift the black point down. As you notice, it kind of shrinks our histogram in here and then just kind of add a little, S curve. But what I like to do with the tone curve is use it for color grading. So I'll go in, you have your red, green, and blue. Red's going to shift from, it's going to push the red channel and shift those more red. It's going to shift them more cyan, kind of blue-green. You have greens that are going to go from your green channel. You're going to have green to magenta, right? And then you have your blues, which is blue to yellow. But what I like to do is take the blue channel and shift the darker tones a little bit cooler, just so that way her skin tones kind of still have its natural warmth from the sun, but we can cool some of this background down, which is kind of nice. And then what we can do is if we want to bring some of those midtones back to warm, we can. It's really simple for us to do. So we can get kind of this cooling look, very subtle for the background, but also make sure we're retaining some of our warm tones. Now we might have gone a little too heavy, as you can see the shift on her face. So if we want to necessarily cool down the skin tones, we can drop that end of the curve. But I think something like this is going to be about where we want to shift this image. Now, let's see here. Oh, don't want to do that. We'll delete that control point. But if we push this a little bit further, we can get those background tones a little bit cooler. Now, normally you'd want to correct for those and you'd be like, oh, well, this image is a little bit cool. It needs to be warmed up. But from a creative perspective, I mean, that's kind of some of the control that we're going after here. So in kind of leaving this image about where it is here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my HSL panel and I'm going to start to boost some of these colors. So I can use my target adjustment tool to start to shift some of the luminance of the blues if I want to darken those down a bit, as well as if I want to pump up saturation a little bit. Same goes for the skin tones. So if I want to see if I can drop some of the saturation here, let's see. We don't want to do that too much to the skin tones here. I think the skins are pretty bright, but we can pump up the luminance here and these red and orange tones. Right, so if we boost those up, obviously we're affecting her skin tone. So this might be something we go in and just do a little bit of brush work. as well. And so you have to be careful with HSL, right? Because it's all or nothing. It's not just going to affect one part of the image, but it's going to be something that you want to use to accentuate some of the areas of the image, and in some cases it might start to distract. So what we can do now is we can start to burn down some of the distractions in the background, some of this bottom of our skyline here, as well as we can dodge some of the dress and maybe even bring down some of the work on her face here. Let's see if we can just drop some of the luminance just to darken some of that. And something here too, I'd want to dodge some of her shadows on her face. So if we go back into our adjustment brush panel, we can go in and start to make subtle adjustments to just those little areas. So what I would do is a little less exposure and a little more highlights to correct that specific area. And so we can always increase this once we kind of add that in. But something just to add a little bit of definition on that harsh shadow there on our face, we can just add a little bit of definition there, as well as we can create if we want to dodge her arm a little bit, do something a little more subtle. And now the big thing is we wanted to bring some of that dress out right here because it kind of gets lost in the muddiness. So in pumping that up, maybe we want to take up the saturation. It's got some reds, maybe a little bit of clarity as well. We can take the exposure up, and I think that's about what we'd want to do. I mean, it's already giving us a little more of a boost to that part of the image. Now, if you want to make sure we're not missing anything on our mask, I would want to do the same thing up here. Right, so that way those reds push a little bit further. And if we want to increase it, we can. If we want to push the saturation a little bit further, we certainly can. Take the shadows up. It might be a little far, but just that subtle kind of adjustment, last minute adjustment there can really help out, really help our image out here. And so with the dodging and burning, yeah, we did a few different layers of adjustments to pump things up. But once we kind of pull everything together, we can kind of start to look at now where can we burn down these distractions, where can we add a little more definition in this image. And so if we like the way that she looks or we think she's too bright, my quick adjustment would be to drop the overall exposure down, a couple bumps, if we want to bring it all down together collectively. And then we can go back in and start to do some, we can start to just do some burning. So burn down, create our brush. Again, we can adjust this later. If we want to kind of burn these areas down. Make sure not to forget that spot there. Haloing is very important, so you might want to just come over the dress just a bit. Now, we probably don't need to do that much down. But as we bring that down further, what starts to become more apparent are these inside panels. So We don't really do that much. Just a subtle change there, as well as in the landscape, just to give it a little bit of definition. I think that starts to look good, as well as the ground here. Oh, don't want to go that far. So in looking at how we can fine-tune some of the background here, I think it becomes, you could spend all day dodging and burning and pushing the the background here, but I think at a certain point you're looking at what's where the image needs to go, how much further. We can do this by color, so we can make sure only the blues are being adjusted here and not our subject. Let's drag this down further. So I think that we're about where we want this image to be. Close that down and kind of see how close we got in comparison between our original edit here. Oh. And so there are definitely some subtle differences, and each kind of edit you can go a little bit further, right? So we could take this image, probably lighten it up to get a little bit closer, right? So we can spend, a lot of time and dodging and burning and editing, of course, to, make our image getting to our end result here. But end of day, it's the, pushing these adjustments, attention to detail, fine-tuning our image. I mean, those are the, that's always going to be part of the creative aspect of editing. Not to get long-winded here, but the kind of my final stage here would be adding some sharpening. So in zooming into this image, well, just adding a little bit of definition can really go a long way here. So if I add 50 in there, it'll make my subject pop off the page just a bit here. So yeah, let's move on to the last steps here. So now there we have it, right? So we have our final results here. When it comes to creative editing and building up these different techniques and dodging and burning, it really has to start from capture, right? You have to have a good capture. And I'm not talking you don't always have to have off-camera lighting. You don't always have to have the best equipment, but understanding your focal lengths, how you're composing your subject, how you're exposing for the total image. It's very important that you get those details. I mean, you don't always have this kind of gradated blue sky in the backdrop, this beautiful mountainous landscape in the background, but making sure you're exposing for your background. If you can't light your subject, then do that as a plate shot, right? You can do 2 images, so that way you can expose for your subject, expose for your backdrop. Here, in this case, we can kind of do both and darken our background and bring in more of a, be more direct with our main subject so we can direct our audience, right? We want to dodge the client, burn down the background. That's kind of the method here. And so when we're building up those effects, it's really important that you start subtle so you can build them up but not have to work backwards if you over edit, and now you need to remove some of those effects that you applied. So be subtle as you're building these up, so that they blend better and it's more natural. Now, some of the the final things that you want to be thinking about when it comes to the toning and the adjustments are, you have to be careful when you're editing in Lightroom and you export it out of Lightroom. You might have some haloing and things that weren't as obvious when you first started with the image. So understanding the limitations of Lightroom using this program, I think if you have a good grasp of that, and you're a heavy Lightroom user and you're using these techniques, you already kind of know how to use the brushes. I mean, you can't use a Wacom tablet. As you noticed and heard, I'm using a mouse for all of this. So I might have a few Photoshop retouchers out there cursing me right now. That's okay. I mean, this program can do very similar things, as Photoshop can with some of the toning. I urge you to try and break out of your box and push some of these limits and push yourself to try something different. And if you don't like it, at least maybe you learn some techniques and you can move on. So definitely reach out if you guys have any questions. If you've, different techniques and things you've tried, be more than happy to discuss that further, guys. Thanks for tuning in.